Oops. I'm just going to share my slides with you. And it always seems you do it right.
Seems longer when you're doing it.
Yes, I managed to hit the wrong thing. Right, share screen, and there they are.
That's it.
Oh, and yeah. Okay, and somehow it's not going into the slideshow view.
Just go into slideshow at the top there.
It's hidden by the,
all right.
by the other toolbar. Let's move it and slideshow. Yeah.
And play from start. There you go.
That's play it. From start. There we go.
Thank you.
Excuse the clumsy start. So we're going to be talking about supporting invisible disabilities in the workplace. My name's Irene, and the slide is not moving on. There we go. I work for Disability Information Scotland. I'll tell you a bit about us and my role at Disability Information Scotland, but also my background and why, or what has given, where I've got my experience from. So that might give you an idea of where I can be useful to you. So Disability Information Scotland, we run a helpline for disabled people, carers, families, professionals, anybody who has an interest in doing anything to do with disability, people who want to make places more accessible, or disabled people with particular issues, or yourselves, if you're looking for information or suggestions relating to supporting someone or making their premises more accessible or whatever. A lot of what we do is provide a listening ear, and we signpost to who can help. We're not experts in anything, but we will talk about any experience we do have, and we direct to reliable information sources. So I'm on the helpline 5 days a week, mostly, and we also have information on our website. So we have a range of information guides on topics that are of interest to disabled people, carers and professionals. We update them. We don't always have a chance to update them in as timely a way as we want, but we try to keep them up to date. We have a directory of organisations who provide goods and services. The last time I looked, there was something like 3,400 organisations there. We don't vet them. We can't say whether they're good or bad, but obviously if we did hear something terrible, we would delete them from our website. And we do update regularly, but we're reliant on the organisations to respond to an email. So if you find an organisation on there and the information isn't up to date, give us a shout. We will check that information and either get it updated or remove them from the website. The third part of what we do, we have accessible information training, and we have online courses that they cost, I think, about £10 per person, but they're really quite in-depth about producing information that's accessible and communicating in accessible ways. Sorry, this is moving on without me. I will. So they are There's a lot of information there about how to make all of your communication documents accessible so that people who maybe use screen readers or text to speech can access that. And that's my colleague James that runs those courses. And he will also do bespoke accessible information training for groups online or in person. A little bit about me. My background was in higher education, working in a disability service and as an assistive technology advisor. So I do know a lot about the kind of equipment or technology people use. And also I did work as a freelance needs assessor for students mainly, but in higher education, there's a lot of overlap with the workplace because a lot of people studying things like social work, medicine, or other health degrees and lab technicians. We also had to look at how we could support them and support their departments to make their workplace accessible when they were on placements. So that's where a lot of my experience comes from. And on the helpline, we regularly get calls from people raising issues to do with workplace reasonable adjustments or capability. So we do hear a lot about what's going on for disabled people. So now some of the things that I'm going to go through in my wee introduction will be familiar to you, but it gives us the context. So who's disabled at work? A person who's got a diagnosis of HIV, cancer, MS, or visual impairments, or certified blind, severely sight impaired, or sight impaired, they are, from the point of diagnosis, they are classified as disabled for the purposes of the workplace. This information in this slide comes from the ACAS website, and you'll find in the resources I've linked to some of the information. So who else? This is the kind of classic definition that anyone can fit into, and it's anyone with a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on their ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. So that's where there needs to be some kind of interpretation about what is a substantial impact, and but that's where anyone can be considered disabled. And often if you're in an organisation that's big enough to have an occupational health service, or you use external occupational health, they may do write reports and deciding that. Now, one of the things that I didn't realise until I was going into it in more detail was that someone with a progressive condition is considered by law to have a disability as soon as it starts to have an effect on their normal day-to-day activities, as long as it's going to be long-term, even if it's not substantial at the time, because if it's going to become substantial, they would be classified as disabled. So what we're here to talk about today is invisible disability. So what is an invisible disability? I've broken it down into four groups, basically. A person's got an invisible disability when they've got an impairment or condition that has a significant impact on their day-to-day activities and can't be seen by others. So that can include mental health conditions, and we will talk a bit more about that later. but mental health conditions can cover the whole gambit, from anxiety and depression, which can be mild or severe. There's a whole range within each diagnosis, or other mental health conditions, OCD, schizophrenia, anything, any kind of mental health diagnosis. Neurodivergent conditions, so that can include autistic spectrum disorder, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia. There's a whole range, and some I've seen in some information it was describing Down syndrome as a neurodivergent condition. Essentially, divergence means your brain functions differently, and there can be differences in perception, in how the environment's perceived, and how the brain organizes information. So those are kind of key things about that. And then there's sensory impairments such as visual or hearing impairments. So those are some of the things that could come under an invisible disability. Is that, I think, yeah. And sorry, I forgot about the last click, which is an important one, because I live with an invisible disability myself, and it would come under this latter category, which I almost forgot to tell you about. And that is any chronic condition. Could be an illness, or it could be an impairment, where if someone has an injury that causes them severe difficulty, it's not necessarily visible, but there's lots of different chronic conditions. So asthma, epilepsy, fibromyalgia, MS, rheumatic conditions, chronic pain disorders, these are all fairly common. Musculoskeletal, bladder, bowel. So any of those can be considered a disability if they hit those, if they're either hitting the progressive part, or if they hit those bits where they have a considerable impact on the person for a long period of time. You'll know better what that period of time means, but I think usually it's either anticipated or backwards in terms of a year or more. But I think you can correct me if I'm wrong in that, but that's something I think you'll probably be more familiar with. So
we'll hold that slide for later, shall we? The
yes,
text one? Yep.
That's a little bit about me.
Okay.
And
if you want to on-share, then we can have our conversation.
So
you'll have a stop share somewhere.
Stop share, there it is. Apologies.
No,
it's been a while since I've been on Zoom.
No, I know.
And I moved my toolbar.
You should see me in Teams, or you shouldn't see me in Teams. That's really helpful as some as background and setting the scene for everything. And I think what we'd like to do now is have a conversation. And what I'd like to do, we're going to go through those areas that Irene covered in her slides. So we're going to go through workplace issues for mental health, neurodivergent, sensory visual, sensory hearing, and chronic conditions. And I'll ask Irene some questions. She'll have, I'm sure, very capable answers, but we would love your questions as well. We felt rather than leaving questions to the end, it'd be better to deal with each as it comes along, given that each can be quite different on the impact in the workplace. It's also important for me to point out there's a lot of HR people on the call, which is absolutely fantastic to have you all here. You will have lots of examples. You will have lots of scenarios. And if there's anything that you feel be really helpful to share with us, to share with everyone, we would love you to put that in the chat. If you would like to do it anonymously, because we would want you, of course, to anonymize what you're putting, then in the chat, you could do the chat directly to Lindsay rather than to everybody. And once we go through each of the areas, then Lindsay will pick up any questions for us and we'll deal with it in that way. So this is the open invitation. Go for it with your questions. Go for it with, you booked into this and you thought, well, I hope they tell me about such and such. That's your chance to ask us. So Irene would like to talk first about mental health, and in terms of what the issues are for the workplace. I'd really be delighted to hear what your thoughts are on that, in terms of what you hear.
Well, for a lot of people, the social environment is really important. We do get, if someone has a mental health issue already, then they may be more sensitive and susceptible to any kind of workplace tension or conflict. So that can make it difficult. And also if someone, that the workplace, the environment is really important. Another issue that obviously kind of ties in is workload. Sometimes someone, maybe they've managed to deal with a heavy workload before, but there may be other issues in their life, or maybe just they have become unwell, but they don't know why. It can change how well somebody can manage with their workload. An awful lot of the people who call us, who talk about mental health issues, seem to feel that they have that their difficulties have not always been understood, and often by the time they call us, relationships have broken down, maybe, and that can be difficult because by the time someone has become very stressed, they're also not at their best communicating. So there's a lot of issues there. And they might end up becoming more emotionally reactive, which obviously doesn't help workplace issues, or they might become withdrawn. And sometimes people don't always know themselves what will help. And that can be regardless of whether it's mental health issues or something else. And anything, and like any fatigue can be a huge issue with any disability, but mental health issues can lead to a lot of issues with fatigue from trying to behave as if you're functioning better than you feel is exhausting. So
that's really interesting, isn't it? Do you find in your calls that people are reluctant to tell their employer that they have mental health issues?
Yes, some do, but sometimes people ask, like phone up and ask about whether they should disclose a mental health issue. And one of the, I talk to them about, well, about anything like that, well, your employer isn't legally bound to support you if they don't know that you have an issue. So that can be an issue. But the other thing is, like, if you have, like, I've had a few calls asking this about ADHD, and it's like, well, how much is it likely to impact you in the workplace if you are afraid that there will be prejudice or it's not understood? Then think about how you function. It is a personal decision. People do not have to disclose. But if you are going to need some support, you do need to raise it and look for that support, and preferably before things fall apart.
Absolutely. And I know, and I'm sure the HR folk on here and everyone will know that through employment tribunals, decisions come out that if you don't tell your employer what the issue is, you can't expect them to deal with it. But
Yes.
we absolutely understand that it can be very difficult to disclose something that the individual is also feeling anxious about and getting to grips with as well. And the other bit, and please, hopefully there's comments coming through for mental health, is sometimes, and I know we get it, and we get to help in maybe in mediations or investigations, and we'll have individual employees, maybe witnesses, whatever, and they'll say, I think that person that we're talking about has got mental health issues. And that happens quite a lot in any workplace where folk are concerned about somebody. And I guess, you know, employers and managers just has to deal with that in a way that's dignified and fair in terms of the individual.
Yeah.
Lindsay, were there any, I can see some comments, is anything in relation to mental health that you would like to ask Irene or myself?
There's nothing on the chat in relation to mental health at the moment. There is certainly other questions, and we can keep them for later if you want.
Pick them up as we go.
Yeah.
Perfect, absolutely. Let's move on to the neurodivergent individuals. So what do you hear, and what do you advise on what the issues are?
Well, we get a lot of calls from people who are have a diagnosis on the autistic spectrum, and some people who suspect they may be on the autistic spectrum but can't get that assessment. It can be difficult to get that in any timely fashion, and similarly with ADHD. Some of the things that can be particular issues in the workplace can be sensory overload. Someone who is on the autistic spectrum, or often people with ADHD and other issues, things like background noise can be experienced as much more intrusive, and it can be very difficult to focus when there's a lot going on, or to pick out threads of conversation in a room with other people, or and sometimes those sensory issues can impact to the point of adding a lot of stress to that individual. So one person that I had working under me as a tutor, who I learned an awful lot from that person. They talked about things like struggling if they had a meeting where they were put next to a window where there was a lot of traffic noise, but if they were at the other side of the room, it was easier. So there can be very individual things. And sometimes there's technology that can help, like noise cancelling headphones. They can be wonderful things in any shared office or any noisy environment, but sometimes to be able to get a little bit of space or to be able to just withdraw from an environment can be helpful for people. The other thing that can arise with some neurodivergent people is social issues at times. And there's a lot of there's caricatures almost of autistic spectrum and some of the social issues. Some of that, there's, as with any stereotypes, there is some truth, but each individual is different. But there are times when people are not picking up social cues so easily, and also being in for some people, looking at all the social cues that for some individuals have been learned by rote, rather than that feeling where where we don't even notice we're responding or tuning into things. For some people, some of those cues are not natural to tune into. It's a bit like learning to drive or something, where you've got like mirror, signal, maneuver. If you think of that in your just normal day-to-day actions, that can be difficult. And at times people have a weaker filter on what they say. Those things can cause a lot of conflict in the workplace and difficult things, and there can be misunderstandings on all sides. And that can be a difficult one to, and again, if you can notice things arising and find ways of tackling it before they come to phone me, and then and before it comes to that point where when the relationships begin to break down, all of those things get much worse. Also included in neurodivergence is there's things like dyslexia and dyspraxia and dyscalculia. What all of those have in common, with dyslexia, we all know that there can be issues with reading and seeing things on a screen. One of the things that is less commonly realized is that speed of processing information, whether it's verbal or written, can be an issue. And processing information can be an issue for anyone who's neurodivergent in any way. Information can be processed differently, and some kinds of information can be processed more slowly than others. The person that I mentioned before that I worked with, he found it helpful to have like information in written format and verbally. So if you had a meeting, you would follow it up with either follow it up with a written just notes of things, or he would get him to write it and tell you his understanding of it. And that helped him process it and remember it better. So often it's important to double check that instructions are understood the same way. So those are some.
And we know that's an issue for everybody, isn't it? You know,
absolutely, yes.
People go away from a meeting and two different ideas as to what was agreed. But you're absolutely, it's absolutely critical in this instance.
Yes, there was one that I saw come up in the because before doing this, I went and had a look, not an extensive look, but a wee look at some of the tribunal cases. And one of them, where it was someone who was on the autistic spectrum, the employer, the manager had said, it would be nice if you would do this. And the person said they did not understand that as a command to do that thing. And that was upheld. The case, that most parts of that particular case were upheld because there hadn't been the reasonable dialogue, or it wasn't clear, and the person's disability was known about. There were things about the muddy communication. So it's realizing that we all have a responsibility in there to try and clarify those communications. It can happen easily for anybody, but it's even more so with either mental health issues or any kind of disability can cloud how you see things or hear them, and you just need that little bit of extra clarification at times.
And when you mentioned dyspraxia, it reminded me that a case, there's lots of complexities around it, as there always is, but there was one of the things was an individual had dyspraxia and said that they couldn't do the application effectively because they would get everything mixed up. And they asked if they could do it over the phone, if they could phone HR, and HR would ask the questions and just write down what the person would have said. And they didn't in the way that he needed it. And that was found to be discriminatory. And, you know, it's something which And I'm old days. I'm kind of way back of, you know, the days when you looked at an application form and you said that's not very well filled in. That, you know, the writing's all over the place. So it's just, you know, there's so much to think about. So much to think about. I think there's questions about this. Is there, Lindsay?
Yeah, there's quite a lot. I just wondered, Kirsty, you mentioned about the law. Did Irene answer your question in relation to that?
Hi everybody. Hi Lindsay. Dorothy, Irene. Yeah, so I'm a psychotherapist, and actually I would say probably more than 50% of my clients are neurodivergent these days. It's becoming more and more because anxiety levels are generally higher because of the various different traits. But what is coming through really clearly recently is that it's taking months, if not years, to get a diagnosis, an official diagnosis, unless, of course, you pay to go privately to a psychologist and you get that through a different route. And I've actually even had this come up today, where a client is having to have a conversation with their work about the amount of time that they've had to take off, but they don't have an official diagnosis as yet. And I'm just wondering, it's not my place to advise the client about any HR or law matters, but for my own personal knowledge, I don't know how the law copes with that, and how someone who is undergoing the process of being diagnosed with autism, are they still classified under the law as being disabled? And does the employer have that legal obligation to make reasonable adjustments?
That's a good question. If any employment lawyers on here would like to speak up now, we might have one or two.
I'm not entirely sure how that would pan out, but one of the things that is very common while waiting is that people get a diagnosis of anxiety, or get diagnoses of mental health issues. If the person is showing significant struggles at work, then they would come under, and that's something to maybe get them to speak to their GP and speak, and if there are issues, if they are struggling significantly, then maybe they might not get that particular diagnosis, but it can be taken into account and they will have some protection with another diagnosis.
And just to throw in, and I'm sure that a lot of people will say the same, I mean, I feel, and a lot of us, it is best practice to put in adjustment for someone, not just because it's covered by the law. So if someone comes, I've got this is what I would need, then it makes sense to make that adjustment. I think if someone was came to you and said, I'm having difficulties, I've got an assessment, but it's going to take a year and a half to come through, I think that I am neurodivergent, I think it would be remiss of an employer to ignore that. It would be, I would say so.
I know that when I worked in the university, or one of the universities that I worked in, not all universities had access to this, but sometimes people would come through and they wouldn't have had those NHS diagnoses, but they did get screening that allowed a kind of, like, people got screened for ADHD by a clinical psychologist who was in-house, and it meant that they would not have access to any medication or treatment through the NHS. Sometimes they were waiting for that, and they may or may not want to have that anyway. But it did mean that that report formed medical evidence, even although it wasn't an NHS one. But one of the other issues, when you mention people getting private reports, is there are times, certainly within the NHS, where the private report is not accepted. So one of the things is making sure that employers understand the credentials of the people that are writing the reports, and that there is very good, if people realise that the waiting time is so long, then they should know that they can reasonably expect that the person may have it. There are ways
absolutely. And you're reminding me, there's I was going to pop this in at some point, but it's going to pop in now. There's a tribunal case that popped up in August. It was in People Management, and we'll send the link out when Joanna puts the slides out. We've got the slides that cover all these areas that we're talking about. We'll put the link in it for you. Some of you might well already have seen it, but really interesting for the individual was asked by HR to provide their medical evidence to their issues before they would consider reasonable adjustments. The responsibility was put on the employee. The employee went to their GP. Their GP did a letter, but it wasn't great. It ended up in lots of trouble. The tribunal decided that it was inappropriate to expect the employee to provide the evidence themselves, that there should have been, you couldn't expect a GP to have an understanding of the occupational health side of things. And the employer absolutely should have found an occupational health advisor, someone that had the understanding, and then made their judgment after that. But the case then had comments. We had comments from two employment lawyers. One was Dawn Dixon, who some of us I'm sure will know, Anderson Strathern, based in Edinburgh. And her comment on, really interesting for absence topics and disability. And I'll just read this bit. HR practitioners should note that a failure to adjust duties or a practice of applying absence management procedures consistently across a workplace can lead to claims from disabled employees for whom absence procedures could and should be adjusted. Now, what that's saying clearly is, if we're saying, oh, this is a procedure, we trigger a process after 3 frequent absence over a period of time, and if we're doing that for everybody, including those who have a disability, that could be regarded as discriminatory in itself. So, and there is stuff again about best practice being that you shouldn't automatically apply your absence policy to folk who are absent with their disability. Another lawyer made a comment, one from Stevenson Harwood, and the comment was, the case underlines the value of employers using occupational health to discharge their legal obligations to identify and implement the reasonable adjustments to enable a disabled employee to return to work in some capacity. And employers should be proactive in providing professional health services to employees that can assist both parties to determine what reasonable adjustments can be made to the employee's role. So big decisions there in terms of adjusting the absence management process, if making it in itself a reasonable adjustment, and the importance of occupational health to discharge that legal obligation. Absolutely.
That's really interesting, Dorothy. And
yes,
and I've just asked Lindsay to forward me that if she can.
Yes.
That is directly applicable to the circumstances that I heard this morning, and I'm not coming at it from an HR perspective, but just I might just forward that to my client and just help them understand their own position in terms of disability and in terms of the procedure. It's the exact thing, the procedure for absence.
Yes.
That they're going through their normal procedure for absence without adjustment.
I think I've added a link to it in the resources that I created. It's the nurse case with a nurse who had migraines.
All right.
and a lot of absence. So yeah, if it's not the same case, it's a similar
It's a different
judgment.
case. Yeah, it's a different
Um,
case. Irene has very helpfully provided a whole list of resources and links.
mhm.
And we'll send that out to everybody after, along with the more detailed slides and the link for this case that I'm talking about just now. Kirsty, if you need that quicker, then we'll happily send an email out to you after the session.
Thank you.
One point that was raised there about the evidence from GPs, that was also an issue in doing needs assessments for students.
Right.
And one of the things that we did that didn't completely improve it, but we made a form for the GP. It just had about 4 things, but it was actually trying to get them to focus on ability to take notes or to read or to listen, just kind of specific things, and that helped. Sometimes the GPs just completely ignored it anyway, and they may not always have experience of the person in that context. It's not what their job is, but it did help sometimes with where they would say this will undoubtedly affect their ability to concentrate, or so it might be something that you can
And I guess it's in the HR context, I would imagine we would always go to occupational health.
Yeah.
And only if we couldn't, for some reason, get that to be achieved. Because that's going to get with a whole set of questions relating to the job description and the law, etc. But that's helpful to know. I'm conscious of the time, and I know there's more questions in there. Just to say, let's go through the other areas, and if we have time, we can go back to the questions. But if we haven't got time to answer them all, we will do a Q&A out to you. So we'll sit with Irene and we'll go through them, and we'll give an answer to them. So you will get everything responded to. I just don't want to miss out on some of these other areas. Any critical ones, Lindsay, sitting about neurodiversity yet you feel you'd like us to answer?
Well, Fiona Partington's asked, have you found that a diagnosis of generic neurodiversions is more difficult for workplaces to support than specific diagnoses such as ADHD or ASD in terms of guidance and how to reasonably support? And then Callum's asked, aware that no size fits all, however, what are the most helpful practical tools and techniques people who are diagnosed or self-diagnosed to manage their ADHD in the workplace? So both of them are around ADHD related.
Okay, we'll not go into big detail on that because I think we need to move on to the others, but the critical thing for all of that questions is sitting down with the person and asking them what they need, asking them how they go about their day-to-day life, what are the things that limits them, because that's the critical part of all of this, is them. What do you need? How do you adjust your life when you're not at work? What are the challenges that you face at work? And if that's the first question, conversation that happens, it's going to be the best one. But there will be other things that we can add to that. So apologies if I zoom on. I'm zooming on into what? Visual impairment then?
Yeah. So some of the things that are basic in the environment, and you'll see some of this in the blog that I've referenced on our website in the resources, and that will be getting rewritten to make it into a guide. But some of the things in the environment, poor contrast in between windows and doors, in toilets or rooms or corridors, can cause significant problems for people with sight impairment, people who are partially sighted, or a lot of blind people. We think of blindness as being a complete lack of vision, but that's not the case for most people. That can be a huge problem. obviously you're not all going to leave here and go and paint your workplace when you go back, if you're aware of that and you know that there are some people using it. But things like putting posters on a door, if there's a particular place where there's an issue, you can move things around in a more in a cheap way to kind of highlight areas that might be problematic. So poor lighting can be an issue, or a lot of glare. There's different, again, it's very individual what can be a problem. Where, again, also where someone is in a room can matter if someone has a visual impairment. Obstructed pathways can be problematic for people with low vision or who are blind. And also one of the biggest is probably accessing information. Especially if someone has very low vision. And that's where using computers, where a lot of the solutions would be technological, and applications can go into places like Access to Work to get funding, to get software for if someone needs a screen reader. The best software and equipment for that is very expensive, so you would probably want to get that in. But there is also some freely available open source things. If you find you have someone who's waiting to get access to the proper equipment to help them in the workplace because they're waiting for assessment and funding, feel free to lift the phone and ask me if I know of anything, because there's a lot of free resources. The other thing is our accessible information training can make a big difference in that if someone does use screen readers, one of the things people don't often use that is very simple and straightforward and makes a document much more accessible is using the inbuilt features in Word to make proper structures within the document. So instead of just using bold to make your heading, you make a heading style. Learn about heading styles, because if it's just bold, a screen reader, just close your eyes and listen to it being read out. If you're trying to find a paragraph further down, you won't find it. And one way you can see how it might move is to look at outline view in Microsoft Word, and you'll notice that the text disappears and you can navigate. That's how a screen reader works. So things like that are sources. That's the kind of information that I can give you, and also our course can give you more detailed stuff for people to learn about that.
That's really helpful. I'm gonna resume on a wee bit. There's obviously more that you can put in, but we can put it in.
Sorry, I can talk a lot.
No, you're passionate about what you do, and that's just wonderful. I love hearing you talk about it. We've got two areas. We've got hearing, and then we've got chronic conditions. Yeah. So, and we're at 12:51. So,
okay, I
run
will
through the hearing and then move to the chronic.
I'll kind of batter through this, and then we can get a discussion. So, for hearing impairment, you want to, if you've got hearing loops in the place, one of the things I've seen happen often is that nobody knows how to switch it on or use it. So make sure that they can be. That's helpful for some people with hearing aids that can connect to that. And you can get a portable hearing loop that can be used in different areas in your workplace if it helps. One of the biggest things, though, is probably the group culture. We all naturally talk over each other at times, and we kind of talk like this. All of those things are massive hurdles for someone with a hearing impairment. Many people, they may not use sign language or whatever. They may lip read to an extent, or they may just do neither, but just strain to hear. So it's quite important to, especially if people are saying, I'm having difficulty in group situations, create a culture where only one person is speaking at a time. Sometimes that can be helped by passing something. It's like, when you hold that, you're the only one allowed to speak. And also microphones can be useful. We don't think of using them in a room where most people can hear, but it can be massive for someone with a hearing impairment. And allowing recording, where in a meeting, you can set parameters for that. It has to be deleted after the person has taken notes, but that can help. British Sign Language, people think of that as something where they think of it as English. It's important to know it's not entirely, it's related to English, but it's a language in its own right. This means that someone who uses British Sign Language, and especially someone who's been deaf all their life, may not follow as quickly with captioning. So if you can get BSL interpreters for that person, that can make a massive difference. And there are various resources for live captioning and for BSL, even remotely, that you can get. It's often hard to get them, but just don't think of it as necessarily, it's like, well, why can't they just read it? It's not always the same. Again, speak to the individual. People don't use all the same things. Okay. So I'll just jump. Will I jump straight into chronic illnesses, and then we can do. So the kind of issues people come up with chronic conditions or impairments. Fatigue is across the board. Any disability or pain or whatever can cause fatigue. And that can be a wee bit of tiredness, or it can be, I cannot keep my head up. I am going to, and there's a lack of understanding of that level of fatigue, and it can be common and crippling for people with chronic conditions. Brain fog can come with an awful lot of things, can be related to fatigue, but can just be fog. It's very descriptive, but it comes with a lot of conditions. And affects your ability to carry out mentally concentrated tasks. Pain or weakness, so that can affect your capacity, your manual dexterity and your mobility, and can affect your typing or lifting. These are common issues. Time required for medical appointments is a big one. An awful lot of disabled people end up making a lot of time back because they worry so much about taking time off for medical appointments. Disabled people often will need more appointments, and they may be dealing with side effects of medication and changes in capacity over time. The things that people call us about a lot are feeling that the issues that maybe sometimes they're not believed, and also that often when capability changes, some of those people are still capable of doing a significant amount of the work that they were doing, but not all of it. Others, sometimes even by the time they call us, are beginning to see that actually maybe I'm not that capable, and it's finding the best ways to navigate that. but often communication can be a problem over those issues, and it can be terrifying because there's someone maybe won't recognise that if they are looking at the prospect of not being able to pay their rent and keep a roof over their head. They don't want to, it can be very hard to see there may be other ways of supporting them, and they can do that. So these are the things people call about. And of course, physical access, if someone can't sit down, that might not be visible. If they can't get a seat in a place, if they're going into rooms where there's meetings and people are standing a lot, it can be difficult. So that was a quick battering through the last couple of
Absolutely. And I
slides.
just saw one question coming up that I can answer with great expertise. Is ME or CFS, which is interchangeable, covered under the disability? It absolutely is. I have ME, and the chronic fatigue that Irene's talking about is extraordinary at times. And I think the big thing for the, I'm adding on to your really helpful information, Irene, is that with chronic conditions, they are so different for every individual. And that, back to that importance of having that conversation with people right at the beginning, once it's raised, as to how they're experiencing their condition. ME is something which, like autism or neurodivergent, can take a long, long time to diagnose. So there's lots of issues coming with the chronic health side of things. We had a slide on tips, but we'll send that out to you all. Are there any critical questions that anybody does not want to leave until we've answered them? We'd be happy to take one more question in the last minute that we have. Anything, Lindsay, that you think is critical that is in the box? Yeah, thanks, folk. I know if you need to leave.
There's a good few that have already been covered already. Hearing loss, autoimmune diseases, covered under hidden invisible disability. Well, that's just been covered, I think. So there's one really good one, and unfortunately Jeremy is like, who said that it was very useful, and thanks, Irene. But he did say he finds it curious that from the definitions it appears that there is a requirement that a condition has a significant impact on your day-to-day life in order for it to be classed as a disability. Does this mean that if you found methods of managing a condition such that you mitigate significant impact, means it is not considered a disability despite the strain it may cause? I thought that was
I think a way to answer that would be, if I'm picking Jeremy up right, is, and I think he's gone now, is that if someone, as Irene described all the different categories right at the beginning, if someone they go to occupational health and they say, yes, you're covered by the Act for that illness, and here's what the workplace could do, and I've also advised the person, here's what they can do to help support their attendance at work. But the person isn't doing any of the activities to help their attendance at work. That becomes a different issue and managed in a different way, I would say. A difficult one, a challenging one, a sensitive one, but a different issue in terms of how they're contributing to their health at work, I think.
I did see some definitions that were saying, yes, if the person can be considered to have a disability if they didn't do these things and it would cause significant issues. So they can still be considered disabled, but whether they have a grievance or not is a different matter. If they are not, if they're resisting anything that might be put in place. So there's different issues there. They're still disabled, but they're, yeah,
that's really helpful, Irene. Guys, I think I'll draw this to a close. Irene, your passion about this is fantastic. People will have you on speed dial, I'm absolutely sure. Joanna, you'll be sending out, as I said, the slides, the resources, the link to that ET case. the questions that we weren't able to answer, if there's any remaining ones, we will answer those and put it out with all of that stuff I've spoken about. So thank you, Irene, very much. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. So